Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today I'm going to talk about world building and believability. When we world build, we can create a world that is anything that we want it to be, but it still needs to feel realistic to the reader. The reader still needs to buy into this world and believe that it really exists. So today I'm going to go over a few reasons that your world might not seem realistic or some issues that could make it difficult for the reader to suspend disbelief. So number one is rule fudging. If you set up a rule, you have to follow it through the entire book. Now there might be situations where exceptions to rules can create like a plot twist or some kind of surprise, but in general, it's pretty rare that you would want to include exceptions, and it can come across as a little bit lazy or a little sloppy. And unfortunately, it makes the reader a little bit too aware of the writer and the writer's intention, and that's when you cause issues with the suspension of disbelief. You don't want the reader thinking about why you made this choice or thinking that you're trying to fill in plot holes basically by fudging the rules later on. Now, the kind of situation I'm talking about is something where maybe you say, only those with the king's blood can wield the magical saber. And you follow that through for part of the book, and then all of a sudden the protagonist wields this magical saber and you sort of fudge the rule. Then you add something in like, well, if you embody the spirit of the king, even if you don't have the king's blood, then that also can count. But then you open up a whole different can of worms. Then readers are wondering, well, why aren't there other people who embody the spirit of the king? Why is it only the protagonist who is this exception? And things can get really sloppy really fast. So if you realize that you need to change a rule, it's best to change it throughout the entire story to come up with one rule that makes sense the entire time, rather than trying to create exceptions to rules or try to give explanations for why something works different in one situation than another situation. It is very rare that that works. It usually just comes across a little bit like you're cheating or you're fudging things. So if you do have genuine exceptions to rules that need to be explained and are relevant to the plot, there are two ways you can handle it. The first is to introduce the exception before it's relevant, so the reader already knows about it. It doesn't feel like you just conveniently changed the rules to suit the different scenes. The second option is to have the characters be surprised. If the characters are surprised and they don't know what's going on, it really helps the reader to believe that this is a genuine and unusual exception. What you don't want to do is get into info dumping in the narration where you're just giving this elaborate explanation of, well, in this situation it's different because, well, and sometimes it's this way, and then in other times it's this other way, and then, well, this character is different from this other character, and that's why the potion acted different or why the sword acted different. You do not want to get into that kind of territory. It starts to feel like you're making excuses, and it really hurts the reader's ability to believe in the world you've created. The second thing that can affect believability is not following your own rules or not having characters utilize things that you've established earlier in the book. For example, if you explain that teleportation exists, it's super cheap, everybody does it, and then your characters get horses and trot themselves over to where they need to be, it's very strange. Readers will wonder, why didn't they use the teleportation? A lot of the time, this kind of mistake happens because the writer wants to include, for whatever reason, horse travel, despite the fact that they already set up teleportation as travel. But it doesn't really work unless you're going to give an explanation. It's not that hard to give an explanation. You could say the teleportation machine broke for some reason and they couldn't get to any other teleportation devices. But make sure, if you're not following established rules, that there is some reason for that. Be aware of what you've established and how that may be affecting how the reader interprets the other elements of the story. The third thing that can hurt believability is a little bit more subtle, and that is the world is too static, too much the same. Everybody is a little too uniform. Everybody's a little bit too comfortable with the way things are. There isn't enough tension, there isn't a lot of desire for change. Everybody just accepts the way things are, and everything seems as if it's been this way for who knows, decades, 100 years, and nobody is wanting to change anything. Things will always change. The world is always evolving, so your world needs to always be changing and evolving too, on a big scale as well as on a smaller scale. For example, the political party that is not in power is always going to be trying to overthrow that other party. They're always going to be trying to get into power. Unless you have a king, in which case there are always going to be people who are trying to overthrow the king who don't agree with him. If everybody is just happy with the way the politics are and happy with the king, it's not really very logical. No matter how great the king is or how great the political party is, there's not ever going to be 100% satisfaction, 100% agreement. On a smaller scale, there's always going to be changes in fashion and food and culture, celebrities, music, movies, books. There's always going to be changes. So there's always going to be some tension between generations and tensions between more modern focused people and more traditionally focused people. There's always going to be new and evolving elements of society. The fourth thing that can hurt believability is not considering the interconnectedness of the world. Everything that happens affects other things, and sometimes it's really easy to overlook that. For example, you could mention there was a big war 10 years ago, but there's no evidence of that war in society. For example, there will be widows, there will be people who lost their land or who lost their job when they fought in the war, people who came back injured from the war, who maybe can't do their jobs anymore, or people who are traumatized from the war. If the war happened on the soil of this land that you're writing about, there will be maybe craters where things blew up, there will be destroyed villages, there will be lots of physical and emotional evidence that this war took place. Really think about how the history of your world affects where the world is now. A lot of the effects are going to be a lot more subtle. For example, maybe there are swarming beetles in your land, and those beetles would get into people's houses. So maybe there's a whole business of preventing beetles from getting into houses, or maybe people have special doors that the beetles can't get under, or they can't get through the keyholes. Things like that make a huge difference in the believability of your world, because it adds so much depth and detail when you think about how one thing affects other things. I really hope you found this video helpful. Tomorrow I'm going to go over more specific, nuanced details of things you might be overlooking with your world building. And basically, I just want to go over with you guys the most common mistakes that I see so that you can avoid them. This video has been part of my novel bootcamp series. I will be posting a new video 3 to 4 days per week throughout August. I'll also be hosting free workshops on my blog, so if you want to check that out, I'll put the link in the description. Happy writing, guys!